Across the United States, from the deserts of the Southwest to the humid Southeast and all the way down the great river valley of the heartland, the rivers are running lower and lower, diminished by prolonged drought, drawn down by a steadily warming climate, and burdened by a demand that keeps on growing. Some of the nation's most important rivers are carrying noticeably less water than they once did, and the cities that depend on them are watching, closely and anxiously, because their water, their economies, and their very futures are all tied directly to the flow of these shrinking streams. A city is only as secure as its water supply, and when the river that feeds a city runs low, the people who manage that city's water begin to watch the levels with a new and anxious intensity, calculating how long the supply will last, how deep the shortage may grow, and what must be done to protect the water on which everything else depends. This is the story of America's rivers running lower, and of the cities that are watching them most closely, a journey across the whole country to understand how the decline of the rivers is felt in the great urban centers that depend on them for their very survival. Before we begin, one honest word. To say the rivers are running lower and the cities are watching does not mean these cities are about to run dry or that disaster is imminent. It means they face real and growing challenges, that their water can no longer simply be taken for granted, and that understanding how they watch and how they respond reveals the true shape of a quiet crisis unfolding across the nation. Quick honest word before we dive in. A lot of people watch these all the way through, love them, and forget the one small thing that keeps a channel like ours going, hitting subscribe. If you are finding this important, take 1 second and subscribe right now. It genuinely matters for us and costs you nothing. And drop your city or state in the comments so we can see who is watching. All right, let's begin. Why the rivers are running lower before we visit the watching cities. It helps to understand why the rivers are running lower in the first place, because the same forces appear across the country, from region to region. The first is drought, the prolonged stretches of dry weather that have gripped large parts of the nation, reducing the rain and snow that feed the rivers and drawing down their flows. In some regions, the drought has been severe and sustained, lasting years, while in others it comes and goes, but wherever it strikes, it immediately reduces the water in the rivers and the reservoirs that store it. Drought is the most visible driver of the decline, the dry spell that everyone can feel. Layered on top of drought is the warming of the climate, which reduces the rivers in ways that go beyond a simple lack of rain. Higher temperatures increase the evaporation of water from the rivers and reservoirs, dry out the soils so they absorb more water before it can reach the rivers, and change the behavior of the mountain snowpack that feeds so many streams. So that even in years with decent precipitation, less water ultimately reaches the flow. This warming-driven decline is a persistent force that operates year after year, independent of any single drought. And then there is demand, the ever-growing thirst of expanding cities, vast farms, and thriving industries, which draws more and more water from the rivers. In many cases, more than they can sustainably provide. Together, these three forces, drought, warming, and demand, are draining the rivers, and the cities that depend on them must watch as the water they rely on grows scarcer. Understanding these forces helps to reveal why the cities are watching so closely, because they know that the decline of their rivers is driven by pressures that are not going away and that may well intensify in the years ahead. The desert cities watching the Colorado. We begin in the Southwest, where the great desert cities watch the Colorado River, the most famous and most stressed of America's shrinking rivers, with an intensity born of near-total dependence. Cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix have grown to enormous size in the desert, sustained by water drawn from the Colorado and stored in its great reservoirs. And as the river has declined, and those reservoirs have fallen to historic lows, these cities have been watching the levels with deep concern. For a city like Las Vegas, which draws the overwhelming majority of its water from the shrinking river, the decline is an existential matter, and the city watches the reservoir that feeds it with the vigilance of a community whose lifeline is at stake. These desert cities have responded to what they are watching with remarkable action. Las Vegas has become one of the most aggressive water conservers in the nation, recycling nearly all of its indoor water and waging a determined campaign against thirsty grass, managing to reduce its overall water use even as its population grows. Phoenix has leaned on its diverse sources, its stored groundwater, and its careful planning to prepare for the reductions it faces. But the watching never stops, because the river continues to decline, and the cities know that their preparations, impressive as they are, must contend with a shrinking supply and a warming climate that show no sign of relenting. The desert cities watching the Colorado are perhaps the most closely watching of all, because their dependence is so great and their margins so thin, and their vigilance is a model of how a city must respond when the river that sustains it runs low. They watch not out of idle concern, but out of necessity, because the future of their communities depends on what the river does next. The great reservoirs that store the Colorado's water have become, in effect, giant gauges that these cities monitor constantly, their falling levels a running measure of how much time and water remain. When the reservoirs approach the critical thresholds at which power generation would cease or the water could no longer be released, the watching intensifies to a fever pitch. Because these are the points at which the system that sustains the cities begins to break. The desert cities have learned that they cannot simply assume the water will always flow, that they must track every foot the reservoirs rise or fall, and that their preparations must be ready to escalate as the situation demands. This constant, vigilant watching of the reservoirs is the daily reality of life for the water managers of the desert Southwest, a reflection of just how much depends on the shrinking river and how little margin remains. Here is something I would genuinely love to know, and it takes 10 seconds. Which river does your own city or town depend on, if you know? Tell us in the comments, because hearing from people across the country makes these videos better, and I read every reply. Okay, back to the cities. Atlanta and the Chattahoochee it depends upon. From the deserts of the Southwest we travel to the humid Southeast, to Atlanta, a great and fast-growing metropolis that watches a surprisingly modest river with growing anxiety, the Chattahoochee. Atlanta is one of the largest and fastest-growing cities in the country, and yet it depends heavily on the Chattahoochee, a river that is small in comparison to the enormous demands placed upon it for much of its water. This is an unusual and precarious situation because Atlanta is a major metropolitan area drawing a large share of its water from a river that was never especially large. And as the city has grown and periodic droughts have gripped the region, the pressure on the Chattahoochee has intensified. Atlanta watches the Chattahoochee and the reservoirs that store its water with real concern, because in dry years the river and its reservoirs have fallen to worrying levels, raising the specter of shortages for the great city that depends on them. The situation is complicated by the fact that the river is shared with other states downstream, leading to long and bitter disputes over the water, as each seeks to protect its access to a supply that cannot easily meet all the demands placed upon it. Atlanta's story illustrates a surprising truth, that water scarcity is not only a problem of the arid West, but can arise even in the well-watered Southeast, wherever a growing population presses upon a river that is too small to provide an unlimited supply. The city watches its river closely because its remarkable growth has run up against the limits of its water, and its future depends on managing the balance between its expanding needs and the modest flow of the Chattahoochee. It is a reminder that even in a green and rainy region, a city can find itself watching its river with anxiety when the demand outgrows the supply. The disputes over the Chattahoochee have dragged on for years, pitting Atlanta and its state against neighbors downstream who depend on the same water for their own farms, communities, and ecosystems, a long-running conflict that shows how the decline of a shared river can set neighbor against neighbor. As Atlanta continues to grow, adding new residents and new demands year after year, the pressure on the modest river only increases, and the margin between the water available and the water needed grows ever thinner, so that even a normal dry spell can tip the region toward shortage. Atlanta watches its river with the awareness that its future growth and prosperity are bound up with a supply that is already stretched. And its situation is a preview of what many other growing regions may face as expanding populations press upon rivers that were never large enough to provide an unlimited supply. El Paso and the Rio Grande on the border our journey continues to the southwest border, to El Paso, a desert city that watches the Rio Grande, the great border river, with the careful attention of a community that has always known the value of water in a dry land. El Paso sits in an arid region where water has never been abundant, and it has long depended on the Rio Grande, along with groundwater for its supply. But the Rio Grande has been running low, stressed by the same forces of drought, warming, and demand that afflict the other rivers. And in the driest year stretches of it have run so low that they have gone dry entirely, a stark and alarming sign of the pressure on this vital stream. For a city that depends on the river, such a decline is a serious matter, watched with the closest attention. El Paso has responded to what it watches with notable foresight and ingenuity, becoming a leader in water conservation and in the development of alternative supplies. The city has invested heavily in the reuse and recycling of water, in the careful management of its groundwater, and even in the removal of salt from brackish water to create new supply, building a diverse and resilient water portfolio designed to withstand the decline of the river. This determined response reflects the reality of watching a river that cannot be relied upon, and it has made El Paso a model of how a desert city can adapt to a shrinking supply. Yet the watching continues because the Rio Grande remains stressed, and the city knows that its security depends on constant vigilance and continued adaptation. El Paso's story shows that a city watching a declining river need not be helpless, that foresight and investment can build real resilience, but also that the watching never truly ends in a region where water is scarce and the river runs low. Quick pause, because this matters and deserves to be seen. If you are getting value from this, tap the like button. It really does help the video reach more people. And if you have family or friends in any of these cities, share this with them, because it is genuinely important to understand what is happening to the water they depend on. One like, one share to someone you care about, and let's keep going. New Orleans and the mighty but vulnerable Mississippi. Our fourth stop takes us to the great river of the heartland, the Mississippi, and to New Orleans and the other cities along its lower reaches, which watch the mighty river with a concern that surprises many people, because the Mississippi seems far too large to be a source of worry. The Mississippi is one of the great rivers of the world, carrying the waters of a vast basin that spans much of the country, and the cities along its banks depend on it for their drinking water, their commerce, and their way of life. It seems, at first glance, an inexhaustible flow, and in most years, it carries tremendous volume. Yet even the Mississippi has shown a surprising vulnerability, and the cities that depend on it have learned to watch it closely. In periods of severe drought, the Mississippi has fallen to strikingly low levels, and when it does, a particular danger emerges near its mouth, where the reduced flow can allow salt water from the sea to push upstream, threatening the drinking water of the communities that draw from the river. New Orleans and other lower Mississippi cities watch for this saltwater intrusion with real concern, because it can contaminate their water supply, and they have had to take measures to guard against it in the driest times. The low levels also disrupt the barge traffic on which so much of the nation's commerce depends, affecting the economy of the entire region. The vulnerability of the Mississippi is a powerful reminder that even the mightiest of America's rivers is not immune to the pressures of drought and a changing climate, and that the cities along it must watch even this great flow with vigilance. The Mississippi cities watching for the river to fall too low illustrate that the challenge of the running rivers reaches even the well-watered heartland, and that no river, however mighty, can be taken entirely for granted. The economic stakes for these cities are enormous, because the Mississippi is one of the great highways of American commerce, carrying a vast quantity of the nation's grain, fuel, and goods on the barges that ply its waters, and when the river falls too low, those barges must lighten their loads or halt altogether, disrupting the flow of commerce that the region and the nation depend upon. So the cities along the lower Mississippi watch not only for the threat to their drinking water, but for the threat to their economy, monitoring the levels with an eye to both the salt creeping up from the sea and the barges struggling in the shrinking channel. It is a striking thing that a river so vast and so powerful can nonetheless fall low enough to cause such worry, and it underscores how far-reaching the challenge of the declining rivers has become, touching even the mightiest waterway in the land. The California cities and the rivers of the valley our journey now carries us to California, where great cities watch the rivers of the state's vast central valley, the Sacramento and San Joaquin and their tributaries, which gather the water that sustains an enormous share of the nation's food and supply the cities of the state. California's cities and farms depend on these rivers, fed by the snowpack of the Great Mountains, and as the state has endured its cycle of drought and the pressures of a warming climate, the flows have diminished and the competition for the water has intensified. The cities watch the snowpack in the mountains and the levels in the reservoirs with close attention, because the water that sustains them depends on the snow that falls in the winter and the flows that follow in the spring. California's situation is complicated by the enormous demands placed on its water, from its huge population, its vast agriculture, and the needs of the environment, all competing for a supply that varies dramatically from year to year and that has come under increasing strain. In the dry years, the cities face restrictions, the farms cut back their planting, and the delicate balance of the Great Delta where the rivers meet comes under threat. The California cities watching their rivers must contend with a boom and bust cycle of wet and dry years, made more extreme by the warming climate, and they have invested in conservation, in recycling, in storing water, and in diversifying their supplies to weather the swings. The story of the California cities and the rivers of the valley is a reminder that even a wealthy and technologically advanced region must watch its water closely when the rivers run low, and that the decline of the rivers threatens not only the cities, but the food supply of the entire nation, tying the fate of these distant waters to tables everywhere. There is an added dimension to California's watchfulness, because when the rivers run low, the farms and cities often turn to pumping groundwater to make up the difference, drawing down the underground reserves faster than they can be replenished, and, in some places, causing the very land to sink as the aquifers are depleted. So the watching in California extends beneath the ground as well as along the rivers, a vigilance over both the surface water and the hidden reserves that together sustain the state. It is a reminder that the challenge of the running rivers is often intertwined with the depletion of groundwater, and that a truly watchful city must keep an eye on both. Alright, I know, second time I am bringing this up, feel free to sigh at me. But quickly, if you have made it this deep into a video about America's rivers and cities, you clearly care about this stuff, and a lot of you who watch have not subscribed yet. That one tap genuinely tips the scales for a small channel like ours. No guilt, just a grateful ask. That is the last time. Promise, let's finish. How a city actually watches its rivered is worth pausing to consider what it actually means for a city to watch its river, because the phrase describes a real and sophisticated process, not merely a figure of speech. When a city depends on a river, the people responsible for its water supply monitor that river with close attention, tracking the flow. The levels in the reservoirs, the snowpack in the mountains that feed it, and the forecast for the season ahead, building a constant picture of how much water is available and how long it will last. This watching allows the city to anticipate shortages before they arrive, to plan its response, and to take action in time to protect its supply. And it is one of the most important tasks of the people who keep a city's water flowing. A city that watches its river well can prepare for the dry years, while a city that fails to watch may be caught unprepared. The watching also drives the city's response, because what the managers see in the river determines what actions they take. When the river runs low, they may call for voluntary conservation, then impose mandatory restrictions as the shortage deepens, drawing on stored reserves, seeking alternative supplies, and adjusting the city's use to match the shrinking flow. The watching thus connects directly to the actions that protect the city, a continuous cycle of monitoring and response that allows a city to adapt to the changing river. Understanding this helps to reveal why the watching matters so much, because it is through this vigilance that a city sustains itself in the face of a declining river, anticipating the challenges and responding in time. The cities that watch their rivers most closely and respond most wisely are the ones best able to weather the decline, and the watching is, in a real sense, the foundation of a city's water security in an age of running rivers. What the watching cities are telling us. Having traveled across the country, from the desert cities watching the Colorado to Atlanta watching the Chattahoochee, from El Paso watching the Rio Grande to New Orleans watching the Mississippi, and the California cities watching the rivers of the valley, we can step back and consider what all this watching tells us together. The first lesson is that the challenge is widespread, reaching into every region of the country, not confined to the obvious dry lands of the West, but touching the humid Southeast, the great heartland, and the fertile valleys of California. Cities everywhere are watching their rivers with a new intensity because the same forces of drought, warming, and growing demand press upon the rivers across the nation, and the security that was once taken for granted can no longer be assumed. The watching cities are a sign that the relationship between America's cities and their water is changing, that the abundance of the past is giving way to an era of vigilance and careful management. The second lesson, however, is one of hope as much as concern, because the cities that watch their rivers most closely are also, in many cases, the ones taking the most determined action to secure their water. Las Vegas has conserved with remarkable success. El Paso has built a diverse and resilient supply. California's cities have invested in efficiency and new sources. And cities across the country are learning to use less, to recycle more, and to plan for a future of shrinking rivers. The watching is not passive, but active, a vigilance that drives the effort to adapt, and it demonstrates that the decline of the rivers, serious as it is, need not spell disaster for the cities that depend on them, provided they act with foresight and determination. What happens to these watching cities will depend on the choices they make, on how well they conserve, diversify, and prepare, and on whether the nation can rise to the challenge of stewarding its water in an age of drought and warming. America's rivers are running lower, and the cities are watching closely, but their vigilance is the beginning of their response. And in that watchful determination lies the hope that they can secure their water and their futures even as the rivers that sustain them continue to run low. The cities watch because they must, and in their watching lies both the measure of the crisis and the seed of its solution. For most of the nation's history, cities could take their rivers for granted, assuming the water would always be there, flowing as it always had, but that comfortable assumption can no longer be safely made in an age of drought, warming, and relentless demand. The cities that thrive in the decades ahead will be the ones that watch their rivers most carefully and respond most wisely, that treat their water not as an endless gift, but as a precious and finite resource to be guarded and stewarded. America's rivers are running lower, and the closeness with which its cities are now watching is a sign that a new era has begun. An era in which the relationship between a city and its river must be one of vigilance, care, and respect, if the